Before dawn had fully gathered its courage, a thin blue smoke rose from the chimney of a ranch kitchen in central Texas. It coiled into the cold March air, curling over a line of barbed wire and into a silence that had learned to breathe carefully. The scent that followed, bacon, thick-cut and crisping in its own fat, moved faster than any command, slipping past guards, rifles, and foreign tongues. It was the kind of smell that could make a man forget war for a second. It was also the smell that made several captured Japanese women, housed beyond that fence, begin to cry without knowing why. Inside the camp, the kitchen was alive before the roosters were. Pans clattered, coffee hissed, and a stout, middle-aged rancher named Joe Tully wiped his hands on a rag darkened by years of honest grease. He'd cooked for cattle drives before he ever cooked for soldiers, and he approached this morning's task the same way he'd approach a branding day: get it done right, and don't talk too much about it. The army had drafted his hands, not his heart. He didn't care much for politics. He cared about coffee strong enough to walk out of the pot and eggs that didn't bounce. Outside, beyond the wire, 15 Japanese women stood in rigid quiet, wrapped in coarse gray blankets issued the night before. They had arrived late, transported under guard from a Navy vessel that had intercepted them near the Philippines months earlier. The night had been long, cold, and full of whispers they couldn't translate. Their faces were pale with exhaustion, their hair still damp from the morning wash in metal basins. They didn't know where they were, only that it wasn't home. The camp's loudspeaker crackled, a voice, southern and slow, calling out breakfast time. One of the guards, Private Whitaker, a boy with more freckles than authority, shuffled awkwardly. "Guess it's your turn to eat, ladies," he said, half in jest, half in kindness. The women didn't respond. They just stood there, noses twitching faintly toward the smell wafting from the mess hall. One of them, older than the rest, closed her eyes. Her name, written in a ledger no one here could pronounce, meant spring rain. She whispered something in Japanese, and the others looked at her as though she'd uttered a prayer. Joe noticed them through the open kitchen door. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "They look scared to death of breakfast." He turned down the fire, watching the fat dance in the pan. Bacon was rationed tight these days. Half the town back home hadn't tasted it in months, but the army had rules about feeding prisoners. Feed 'em decent, keep 'em calm. It wasn't mercy. It was management. Still, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sacred about frying bacon for people who'd tried to kill your kind. It made a man consider the size of the world and how small the fence really was. The mess hall was plain: wooden benches, tin trays, light bleeding through cracks like thin gold veins. When the women entered, they did so carefully, as if the floor might give way. The guards, unsure of protocol, stood back, letting the smell and the warmth do the talking. Joe served without ceremony, setting down plates with a grunt. Bacon, scrambled eggs, 2 biscuits each, and a cup of coffee so black it could drown memory. At first, none of the women moved. They stared at the plates as though they were traps. One reached out, trembling, to touch the bacon. The grease shimmered against her fingers, and she flinched. Another whispered, "America no tabamono," American food. Then, slowly, they began to eat. Not like prisoners, but like people who had forgotten how. The first bite drew tears. Maybe it was the salt. Maybe it was everything else. Joe turned away, pretending not to notice. "Funny thing about bacon," he muttered. "Smells like home no matter which side you're on." Private Whitaker chuckled nervously. "They sure ain't used to it," he said. Joe shrugged. "War don't cook the same for everybody." The sound of forks on metal grew steadier. One of the women, barely 20, broke into a soft, embarrassed laugh after sipping coffee and nearly choking. The others smiled faintly. The guard at the door grinned, whispering, "Guess she wasn't ready for army brew." It was a small human crack in the armor of captivity, and for a heartbeat, everyone forgot who was supposed to hate whom. But mercy, Joe knew, could feel dangerous. The camp commander, Captain Norris, stepped in, his boots hard on the floor. "Tully," he said, eyeing the scene. "You feed 'em too well. They'll expect it tomorrow." Joe didn't look up. "Captain, hunger's a dangerous prisoner too." Norris frowned, but there was no anger behind it, just fatigue. "Just keep it by the book," he said, and left. By the time the plates were cleared, the air in the hall was thick with the smell of grease and something gentler, something like peace. Joe stood at the sink, staring at the empty plates stacked like medals. He thought of his wife back home, who used to hum while frying bacon on Sundays. He wondered if she'd still hum if she knew he was doing the same for the enemy. Maybe she would. Maybe she'd understand that feeding someone wasn't the same as forgiving them, but it was close. Outside, the sun finally cleared the horizon, spilling over the fence and into both worlds, the one guarded and the one guarding. The women sat quietly in the yard afterward, holding their coffee cups like relics, steam curling up and fading into the wide Texas morning. Joe watched them from the kitchen window, his face unreadable. "Ain't right," he whispered, "but it ain't wrong either." That day, word spread around the camp that the Japanese women had cried at breakfast. Some said it was from shame, others from relief. Joe didn't try to guess. He just cleaned the griddle and poured more coffee, because dawn always came back, no matter what people did to each other in the dark. As the sun climbed higher, the last trace of bacon smoke drifted over the wire again, thin, invisible, free. On the other side, a young woman looked up and followed it with her eyes until it vanished. In that moment, no one watching could tell whether she was remembering home or realizing, for the first time, that mercy had a smell. And by noon, the whole camp would be talking about that strange morning when war met breakfast, and something in both began to change. By the second morning, the smell of breakfast had become a ritual that even the wind seemed to anticipate. The guards joked that the bacon grease could bring peace faster than any treaty, but there was truth tucked beneath their laughter. The Texas camp, built on red soil and quiet unease, was beginning to settle into a strange rhythm. On one side of the wire, ranch hands in uniform brewed coffee and swapped stories of calves and carbines. On the other, 15 Japanese women learned to stand in line for meals served by men who didn't know what to make of them. The war was still raging oceans away, but here, between mesquite trees and fences, life was beginning to tilt toward something gentler, something almost human. Joe Tully didn't talk much about the women. He wasn't the kind of man who put feelings into words. But every morning, as he cracked eggs over the skillet, he thought about how they waited, silent, orderly, eyes lowered, hands clasped. Not with defiance, not with guilt. Something quieter. It reminded him of his wife kneeling in church pews long ago, whispering to a God that also seemed far away. The world was burning, but in this corner of Texas, the fire was being held back by habit, decency, and the smell of frying food. The camp itself was no fortress, just rows of wooden barracks, a guard tower, and a makeshift kitchen big enough for a man with one good skillet and too many opinions. The army had chosen the site because it was isolated. Locals joked it was where even the dust got lost. When the first trainload of POWs arrived months earlier, mostly Germans, some Texans had come out to watch, expecting monsters. They found skinny farmers who smiled politely and tried to trade watches for cigarettes. Now, the Japanese women drew the same uneasy curiosity. Folks from nearby farms whispered that they must be spies or nurses from sunken ships. Some came to the fence just to see them, dressed in plain khaki uniforms, hair tied back, faces expressionless but strangely dignified. Private Whitaker, who was barely 20 and still blushed when spoken to, had started bringing small things from town. A tin of sugar, a handful of pecans, once even a broken pocket mirror. "They don't talk much," he told Joe, "but they bow like it's church every time." Joe grunted, neither approving nor disapproving. "Kindness is a dangerous habit in wartime," he said. "Feels good, so you forget what side you're on." But he didn't tell Whitaker to stop. Inside the camp, days unfolded in a monotonous pattern: roll call, inspection, kitchen duty, silence. The women mended uniforms and swept floors. They ate what they were given and never complained, though the coffee still made them wince. Sometimes, Joe caught them whispering in the mess hall, their hands covering smiles as if joy itself were forbidden. He'd pretend not to notice. For all his gruffness, he'd started saving the crispest bacon strips for them. Waste not, he told himself, though he knew it wasn't about waste. One afternoon, after lunch, a dust storm swept across the camp. It came suddenly, the kind of Texas storm that turned the sky the color of rust and swallowed sound whole. The guards scrambled for cover, the women crouched near the walls, clutching their blankets. Joe stayed by the stove, keeping the fire alive, the way he always did. When the storm finally passed, the fence was half buried, the yard littered with tumbleweeds and broken branches. Out by the mess hall, one of the women was standing alone, brushing dust off the flagpole. She moved carefully, reverently, as though handling a sacred object. Joe watched her from the doorway, the red light of the sunset painting her in gold and blood. He didn't know her name, but in that moment, she didn't look like an enemy. She looked like someone trying to clean the world. That evening, the camp felt changed. The air smelled of dust and bacon, the two Texan elements of eternity. Whitaker played harmonica by the gate, a tune borrowed from his grandmother. It was off-key but honest. The women listened from a distance, their faces unreadable. Then, faintly, one of them began to hum along, a haunting minor melody that didn't belong to Texas or Japan but somewhere in between. The sound drifted through the camp like smoke. It startled the guards into silence. When it faded, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to wait. Joe leaned against the doorframe, wiping his hands on his apron. "Music," he said softly, "that's a dangerous thing too." He didn't say why. Maybe because music, like mercy, didn't know where to stop. Word of the women spread through the local town. At the general store, folks talked about the lady prisoners, who prayed before every meal and bowed to the cooks. Some said they didn't look dangerous enough to guard. Others said danger had nothing to do with looks. A few townsfolk even began sending food, flour, sugar, fresh eggs, to help the cause. Nobody mentioned which cause. Compassion had become its own quiet rebellion. For the prisoners, time moved strangely. They planted a small patch of herbs behind the barracks, growing mint and something that smelled like sesame. They folded paper from the camp's scrap ledgers into tiny birds, lining them on the windowsill. The guards didn't understand why, but Joe did. "It's to keep their hands from shaking," he said. "Gives the mind something to hold when the heart's got nowhere to go." He didn't realize he'd just described himself. By early summer, the camp was running smoother than any officer expected. There were fewer outbursts, fewer fights. The women even began greeting the guards with small nods. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the seed of something living in soil that had known only barbed wire. One morning, as Joe served breakfast, the oldest woman bowed deeply before taking her tray. When she straightened, her eyes met his for the first time. "Arigato," she whispered. The word landed heavy, foreign and tender. Joe froze, unsure what to do with it. "Ma'am," he said finally, because that was the only word he knew for respect. That night, Joe sat outside the kitchen alone, staring at the fence glowing faintly under the moonlight. The wire, once sharp and certain, looked softer now, almost silver. The camp dogs barked in the distance, and somewhere a coyote answered. He thought about what the captain had said, keep it by the book. But what book had rules for this? Feeding strangers, hearing them hum your grandmother's song, watching them cry over bacon? Maybe mercy didn't need orders. Maybe it just needed room to breathe. The next morning, he came early, lighting the stove before dawn. The bacon sizzled, the smoke rose, and again it drifted across the fence, gentle, unarmed, unstoppable. This time, he imagined it carried something more than a smell. It carried a question the war itself couldn't answer. And as he flipped the last strip in the pan, Joe realized he was already waiting for what tomorrow's breakfast might change next. The third week began with rain. Soft, hesitant rain that darkened the dust but didn't cool the heat. It drummed on tin roofs, slid down the kitchen window in crooked lines, and filled the morning air with a scent halfway between smoke and earth. Joe Tully stood by the stove, turning bacon in the skillet, his movements slower than usual. Something about the sound of the rain reminded him of the women outside, waiting under the overhang for the breakfast bell. He could see them through the mist, 15 figures wrapped in damp gray, faces pale, hands tucked inside sleeves. They looked like ghosts who'd forgotten they were alive. He flipped the bacon and watched the fat sizzle, tiny explosions of comfort in a world that had lost its manners. Whitaker shuffled in behind him, yawning, his boots squeaking on the wet floor. "You ever think, Joe," he said, "we're feed-in people who'd have shot us if the map were different?" Joe didn't answer right away. He poured the coffee, let the steam rise between them. "Map's always different," he said finally. "Only thing that don't change is the hunger." When the bell rang, the women entered the mess hall in silence. The rain had left their hair slick and their uniforms clinging to thin frames. They sat as they always did, orderly, proper, avoiding eye contact. Joe placed the plates before them: bacon, eggs, a biscuit. The smell filled the room again, that same impossible blend of grease and grace. But something in the air was heavier now. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the weight of familiarity, the strange comfort of repetition. One of the younger women bowed her head before eating, whispering words that no one understood. Joe paused, rag in hand, as if listening could translate. Halfway through the meal, an accident broke the stillness. One of the women, tiny, nervous, her hands trembling, dropped her cup. It shattered against the floor, scattering coffee and ceramic in dark streaks. Instantly she rose, bowing deeply, apologizing in a flurry of syllables that fell like raindrops. The guards stiffened. Whitaker took a step forward, uncertain whether to help or to scold. But Joe moved first. He walked over, crouched, and picked up the shards himself. The woman froze, watching him. "Ain't nothin' that don't break," he said quietly. "Only thing that matters is how you clean it up." For a moment, there was no war, no language barrier, no orders. Just the sound of rain, bacon cooling, and two people kneeling on opposite sides of history. She bowed again, slower this time, her eyes glistening. Joe handed her a rag. When their fingers brushed, she gasped, not in fear, but in shock at the contact. Skin to skin, warm, alive. The guard at the door looked away, embarrassed by the tenderness of it. That small act rippled through the room. The women began to speak softly among themselves, their voices threading together like quiet birdsong. Whitaker tried to joke, "Guess we're running a breakfast church now," but even he sounded changed. The rain outside turned steady, washing the camp clean of dust. The fence glistened silver in the light. After breakfast, Joe stepped outside for air. The sky was the color of pewter. One of the women, the older one they called Spring Rain, was standing by the herb patch they'd planted weeks ago. She was holding a small leaf, pressing it between her palms as though it were a prayer. Joe approached, his boots sinking slightly in the mud. She looked up but didn't move. He pointed to the leaf. "Mint?" he asked. She nodded, smiling faintly. Then, to his surprise, she tore the leaf in half and handed him a piece. The scent was sharp, alive, defiantly fresh against the damp air. He placed it on his tongue, and the flavor burst, bright, green, startling. "Well," he said, "that's better than rations." She laughed softly, the sound like a bell made of air. That afternoon, the rain stopped. The women helped dry the laundry, pinning uniforms along the fence line. The sight was oddly domestic, enemies hanging clothes in the Texas sun while soldiers smoked nearby. One of the guards muttered, "Looks like Sunday back home." Another replied, "Yeah, if Sunday had barbed wire." Even the captain, passing by, didn't interrupt. He watched for a moment, then walked on. Something in him, too, was beginning to bend. Later that evening, Joe found himself writing a letter he didn't intend to send. "Dear Martha," he wrote, "I cooked for the enemy today." She laughed. "Not sure what that makes me, traitor or Christian. Maybe both." He folded the paper, didn't sign it, and tucked it behind the flour tin. Some words were better kept close. The next morning dawned clear, gold spreading across the fields like forgiveness. The women filed in for breakfast again, but this time one of them carried a small bowl covered with a cloth. She placed it on the serving counter and bowed. Joe lifted the cloth carefully. Inside was a rice ball, clumsily shaped, steamed soft and smelling faintly of sesame and mint. "For you," the woman said in broken English. "Thank you, for eat." For a long second, no one spoke. Joe stared at the rice ball, the first homemade food he'd been offered by a prisoner. It looked simple, but to him it glowed like an artifact. He took it, nodded once, and said, Reckon this here's peace disguised as lunch." Whitaker snorted a laugh, but his eyes were wet. They ate together in silence that morning, bacon on one side, rice on the other. The women smiled shyly, the guard sat a little closer, and the fence outside began to feel less like a boundary and more like a forgotten line on a map. Joe couldn't explain it, but the food tasted different. Softer. Truer. Maybe it was the mint still lingering on his tongue. Maybe it was what happens when fear starts losing its appetite. By noon, word had spread again. The Japanese women cooked for the Texans. Some of the men joked that Joe was turning the war into a potluck. But he didn't care. The taste of that rice stayed with him long after the meal ended. It was humble, plain, but it carried something bigger than flavor. It carried understanding. That night, when the lights went out and the camp fell silent, the rain began again. Joe sat by the window, listening. Beyond the fence, he saw faint shapes moving in the moonlight, women folding paper cranes, their shadows long and fragile. The wind carried a scent of mint and smoke, tangled together, inseparable. He thought about hunger, the kind food couldn't cure. In the morning, the bacon would fry again, and the smell would rise, crossing that same fence. But this time, it wouldn't be the smell of war softened by kindness. It would be something else entirely, something that neither side could name yet, but both had already begun to taste. The storm broke before dawn, thunder rolling across the plains like an army returning home. The camp shuddered under the weight of it, barracks creaking, tin roofs rattling, the flags snapping in the wind. Joe Tully woke before the bugle, drawn by the restless sound of rain beating on the windows. He lit the stove, watching the blue flame steady itself, and for a moment he thought of that first morning weeks ago, the smell of bacon drifting through barbed wire, the silence that followed, and the tears that no one understood. The world had turned gently since then, not enough to erase the war, but enough to remind him that mercy could take root even in hard ground. When the rain eased, the sky bled pale silver. The women came from their quarters wrapped in coats too thin for the cold. They were quieter than usual, but not fearful. Their eyes met the guards without flinching now, small gestures of familiarity replacing the cautious obedience that had once defined them. Joe saw it and felt something warm in his chest, the kind of ache that comes from pride mixed with sadness. He poured coffee into tin mugs, his hands steady, his mind elsewhere. That morning, something unexpected waited on the counter. A wooden tray, polished, neatly arranged, sat beside the griddle. On it rested folded napkins, slices of fresh bread baked overnight, and a small note written in shaky English, "Thank you for kindness. Today we cook for you." Joe stared at it, caught between disbelief and reverence. The smell hit him first, a sweet, savory aroma of rice cooked with bacon grease and crushed mint. The women stood in a line by the door, watching his reaction. Spring Rain stepped forward, her posture straight despite her frail frame. "We try American breakfast," she said carefully, her accent soft as silk. "For friends." The guards exchanged glances. Whitaker let out a low whistle. "I'll be," he said. Joe didn't move for a long time. Then he smiled, slow, tired, genuine. "Well, ladies," he said, "I reckon I'll set the table." They ate together under the leaky roof, steam rising from mismatched plates. The rice was warm, flavored with bacon fat and a hint of pepper. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow it did, like two languages finding a shared word. The women laughed softly when the soldiers coughed on the spice. Whitaker tried to teach them how to say, "ain't half bad." It came out, "an heart bad," and they all laughed harder. Even Captain Norris, stopping by on his rounds, paused at the doorway and shook his head. "You're running a diner in the middle of a war, Tully," he said. And for the first time, nobody's complaining. For a brief hour, the camp forgot what it was. The guards leaned their rifles against the wall, the women traded smiles instead of glances, and the rain outside softened into a rhythm that felt almost like forgiveness. Joe looked around the room and saw something he hadn't seen in years. Peace that didn't come from orders. Came from people simply choosing not to hate. After breakfast, Spring Rain approached him again. She carried a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges. "For you," she said. Joe unfolded it carefully. Inside was a sketch, done in pencil, faint but precise, of the kitchen, the stove, the frying pan, and him standing behind it with a cloud of steam rising. Beneath it, in uneven handwriting, were 4 words: "Mercy tastes like morning." Joe stared at the drawing, his throat tightening. He wanted to say something, anything, but words seemed too small for what she had given him. Outside, the sky cleared, blue spilling across the horizon. The fence glimmered, wet and harmless for once. Some of the women were hanging laundry again, their laughter rising above the hum of cicadas. The guards didn't stop them. Joe stood at the doorway, watching. Whitaker joined him, hands in his pockets. "You think they'll remember this?" he asked. Joe kept his eyes on the fence. "They will," he said. "And so will we." A truck arrived at noon, dusty, olive drab, carrying an officer Joe didn't know. Orders had come down. The Japanese women were to be transferred to another camp closer to the coast. No one spoke for a long while. The guards nodded mechanically, faces blank. Joe felt the same ache he used to feel after branding season ended, when the cattle were gone and the land suddenly felt too wide. He walked back into the kitchen and began packing what little he had to give: some biscuits wrapped in cloth, a small jar of honey, and one last handful of bacon. When the women gathered by the truck, they stood in a neat line, eyes shining with something too complex to name. Joe approached them, holding the small bundle. "For the road," he said. They bowed deeply, each one in turn. Spring rain was last. She pressed her hands together, then touched her heart. "We remember morning," she whispered. Joe tipped his hat, unable to speak. The truck started with a cough of smoke. As it pulled away, the women waved, slow, deliberate motions that seemed to slice through the air like pages turning. The dust rose behind them, swallowing their silhouettes. The camp was quiet again, except for the soft hiss of grease cooling on the stove. That evening, Joe sat on the back steps with Whitaker. The sun was setting behind the fence, painting the barbed wire gold. "You reckon that mattered?" Whitaker asked quietly. Joe took a long breath, watching the smoke curl from his pipe. "More than anything," he said. "The war'll end, and folks'll write about bombs and generals. But not about breakfast. That's fine. We'll remember it ourselves." Night came gently. The stars above the Texas sky blinked awake, indifferent but beautiful. The fence threw long shadows across the ground, but they no longer looked like prison bars. They looked like the lines of a plowed field, ready for something to grow. Joe stood, brushed the dust from his hands, and looked toward the horizon where the truck had vanished. The air still carried the faint scent of bacon and mint, stubborn against the wind. He smiled at the thought that somewhere, maybe hundreds of miles away, those women might wake tomorrow and cook the same meal. Maybe mercy traveled farther than hate ever could. When he turned off the stove, the flame flickered once, then died softly. The room went dark except for the glow of dawn beginning again outside, the kind of dawn that didn't ask for sides, only for witnesses. And as the first light spilled over the camp, Joe Tully whispered into the quiet, "Mornin', girls." The smoke from the chimney rose one last time, curling free into a sky big enough to forgive them all. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.